The lawyer's hand shook as he placed the deed in mine, his weathered face etched with urgency. Richard Morris looked like death itself had already claimed half of him, yet his eyes burned with a fierce determination that made my 17-year-old heart race. Outside his cramped office, rain hammered against the windows, while thunder rolled across the Nebraska sky like an omen. You have to understand, I had been waiting 17 years for someone, anyone, to claim me. 17 years of watching other kids get adopted while I remained invisible in the system. 17 years of believing I was unwanted, unloved, forgotten. And now this dying man was telling me that Samuel Sanders, a rancher I had never heard of, had left me everything. 1,000 acres of prime farmland, a house built in 1892, cattle, equipment, and a bank account that would change my life forever. But that moment in the lawyer's office was not where my story began. To understand how I got there, how a throwaway kid from the state system became heir to a fortune, I need to take you back to where it all started. Back to St. Mary's Home for Children, where hope went to die and dreams were luxuries we could not afford. I was 5 when they brought me to St. Mary's, clutching a stuffed elephant that would become my only constant companion for the next 12 years. My mother had overdosed, my father was unknown, and I had no relatives willing to take in a scared little boy with too many questions and not enough answers. The social worker, a tired woman named Diane Howard, promised me it would be temporary, just until they found me a family. 12 years later, Diane was still making the same promises to new kids while I helped orient them to the harsh realities of institutional life. St. Mary's was not the worst place a kid could end up, but it was far from the loving home every child deserves. We lived by rigid schedules, shared everything, and learned early that getting attached to anything or anyone was a recipe for heartbreak. The other kids came and went. Some got adopted by families who saw past their trauma to the potential beneath. Others aged out like I eventually would, thrust into a world that had no patience for their lack of preparation. I fell somewhere in between, old enough to be overlooked by most prospective parents, but young enough to still harbor secret hopes that someone would want me. Lisa Taylor ran the place with an iron fist wrapped in bureaucratic velvet. She was not cruel exactly, but she had seen too many broken kids to waste energy on false hope. When I turned 16, she sat me down for what she called a reality check. The chances of adoption at my age were virtually zero. I needed to start thinking about my future, about trade school or community college, about the apartment I would need to find when I turned 18 and the state stopped being responsible for me. That conversation should have crushed me, but instead it lit a fire in my belly. I started working harder in school, taking every advanced class they offered. I got a part-time job at a local grocery store, saving every penny for the day I would be on my own. I was not going to be another statistic, another kid who aged out and disappeared into the cracks of society. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets wild, and I want to hear from everyone who knows what it feels like to fight for your place in the world. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 2 weeks before my 18th birthday. I was in my final semester of high school, working double shifts at the store, and trying to figure out how I was going to afford college when the state support ended. Diane Howard called me to her office with an expression I had never seen before, confusion mixed with something that might have been hope. She handed me an envelope addressed to me in careful handwriting I did not recognize. The return address showed a law office in a town called Millfield, Nebraska, population 3,000 and change. I had never been to Nebraska. I had never been anywhere, really beyond the 50-mile radius of St. Mary's that defined my entire world. Inside was a letter from Richard Morris, attorney at law, requesting my presence at his office at my earliest convenience regarding the estate of Samuel Sanders. The letter was formal, legal, and completely incomprehensible to a 17-year-old who had never owned anything more valuable than a 10-year-old laptop. Diane made the calls while I sat in her office, my mind racing through possibilities. A mistake, obviously. Some other kid with my name who actually had family, who belonged somewhere. But Richard Morris was insistent. Samuel Sanders had specifically named me in his will, had left detailed instructions about finding me through the state system. He had been looking for me for years. The trip to Nebraska felt like traveling to another planet. I had never been on a plane, never seen landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction without a building or billboard to break the horizon. Millfield was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was usually the high school football team's Friday night games. Richard Morris's office was above the town's only bank, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. The man himself was probably 70, thin as a fence post, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent under the prairie sun. His handshake was firm despite his obvious illness, and his eyes held a kindness that reminded me of the few good adults I had known at St. Mary's. He offered me coffee in a chipped mug and settled behind a desk covered with legal documents, photographs, and what looked like decades of accumulated paperwork. Then he told me a story that changed everything I thought I knew about myself. Samuel Sanders had been my grandfather. Not the grandfather who raised me or taught me to fish or remembered my birthday, but my biological grandfather nonetheless. My mother, Rebecca Sanders, had been his only child. She had left Millfield at 18 after a fight that no one in town ever fully understood, disappearing into the city and cutting all ties with her family and her past. Samuel had spent years trying to find her, hiring private investigators and following dead-end leads across the country. By the time he tracked her down, she was already dead, and I was already in the system. He had tried to claim me then, but the state had rules about distant relatives and proper procedures. A single man in his 60s with no experience raising children was not considered an ideal guardian for a traumatized 5-year-old. So Samuel had waited. He had followed my progress from afar, making sure I was safe, making sure I had what I needed. Every Christmas gift from an anonymous donor, every scholarship that seemed too good to be true, every time the system bent in my favor when it should have broken me, that was Samuel Sanders working behind the scenes. He had planned to reveal himself when I turned 18, to offer me a choice about whether I wanted to know him, to be part of his life. But cancer had other plans. He died 3 months before my birthday, leaving behind a letter for me and a will that made me the sole heir to everything he had built over 70 years of hard work. Richard Morris handed me that letter with hands that trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion I could not tell. Samuel's handwriting was shaky but determined, each word carefully chosen. "Dear grandson," he wrote, "I know you have no reason to forgive an old man who let you grow up alone, but I hope you will understand that I thought I was protecting you. Your mother was hurt by this place, by the expectations and the isolation and the weight of carrying on a family name that meant everything to me and nothing to her. I did not want that burden to fall on your shoulders before you were ready to choose it for yourself. But if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the choice is yours to make. The land has been in our family for 4 generations. Your great-great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1870, carved a life out of prairie and determination and sheer stubborn will. Your great-grandfather expanded it. Your grandfather, my father, nearly lost it in the Depression, but held on through grit and luck and the kindness of neighbors who became family. I built it into something worth having, something worth passing on. But land is just dirt and grass without someone to love it, to tend it, to make it home. I hope you will consider making it yours, not because you have to, not because it is expected, but because you want to, because you choose to." The letter went on for 3 pages, telling me about the ranch, about the town, about the people who had been Samuel's chosen family when his blood family was beyond reach. He wrote about morning coffee on the front porch, about the way the sunrise looked over the east pasture, about the satisfaction of work well done and the peace that came with knowing your place in the world. Reading it, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not just the shock of learning about family I never knew existed, but a sense of recognition, of coming home to a place I had never been. Samuel Sanders understood loneliness. He understood what it meant to be alone in the world, to build a life from nothing but determination and hope. Richard Morris gave me time to process, to ask questions, to understand the magnitude of what was being offered. The ranch was worth more money than I had ever imagined. The house was solid, well-maintained, filled with furniture and photographs, and the accumulated memories of a life well lived. There were cattle to tend, fields to plant, equipment to maintain. It was not just an inheritance, it was a responsibility. but it was also a choice. I could sell everything, take the money, and build whatever life I wanted, wherever I wanted to build it. Samuel had made sure the will was ironclad, that no distant relatives or opportunistic lawyers could challenge my claim. Everything was mine to do with as I pleased. The decision should have been difficult. I was 17 years old with no farming experience, no knowledge of rural life, no understanding of what it meant to manage land and livestock, and the thousand daily decisions that kept a ranch running. I had been raised in the city, educated for college, prepared for a life that looked nothing like what Samuel was offering. But standing in that lawyer's office, looking out at the main street of a town where my family had roots going back 5 generations, I knew what I wanted. Not the money, though financial security was more than I had ever dared dream of. Not the status of being a landowner, though that carried weight in a community where land was everything. What I wanted was the chance to belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than myself, to have a place in the world that was mine by choice and not by default. Richard Morris smiled when I told him my decision, a smile that transformed his weathered face and made him look decades younger. He had hoped, he said, that I would choose to stay. Samuel had talked about me often in his final years, wondering what kind of man I was becoming, hoping that the Sanders stubbornness had skipped a generation and landed in me. The paperwork took days, transferring ownership, setting up accounts, understanding the legal and financial complexities of inheriting a working ranch. Richard Morris walked me through everything with patience and care, introducing me to the banker, the insurance agent, the feed store owner, the veterinarian. Everyone who would be part of my new life if I stayed. Stephen Garcia ran the feed store and had been Samuel's closest friend for 40 years. He was a big man with gentle hands and a laugh that could be heard 3 blocks away. When Richard brought me by to introduce us, Stephen looked me up and down with the careful assessment of someone who had seen plenty of city kids come and go. "You got Samuel's eyes," he said finally. "Same stubborn set to the jaw, too. But the question is, do you got his heart for the work? Land does not care about good intentions, boy. It cares about showing up every day, rain or shine, tired or rested, ready or not." I spent my first week in Millfield staying at the town's only motel, a place that had seen better days but was clean and comfortable enough. Every morning I walked the main street, getting my bearings, introducing myself to shopkeepers and neighbors who remembered my mother as a wild-haired girl who could not wait to escape small-town life. The memories they shared painted a picture of Rebecca Sanders that was both familiar and foreign. Familiar because I could see myself in their descriptions of her restlessness, her intelligence, her refusal to accept limitations. Foreign because the woman they remembered bore little resemblance to the broken person who had given birth to me and then disappeared into addiction and despair. "She was brilliant," said Gloria Bailey, who ran the town's small library. "Smartest kid I ever taught, and I taught for 40 years. But she was angry too, angry at the expectations, angry at the isolation, angry at being different in a place where different was not always welcome." Sandra Stewart, who owned the diner where everyone gathered for coffee and gossip, remembered my mother differently. "She was scared," Sandra said, refilling my coffee cup for the 3rd time that morning. "Scared of being trapped, scared of becoming someone she did not want to be." Samuel loved that girl more than life itself, but he loved this land too, and sometimes those two loves pulled in different directions. The stories helped me understand both my mother's choices and Samuel's regrets. They also helped me understand the weight of the decision I was making. This was not just about inheriting property. It was about inheriting a legacy, a set of expectations, a place in a community that had watched my family succeed and fail for over a century. Richard Morris drove me out to the ranch on a Thursday morning when the spring air was crisp and the sky was the kind of endless blue that made you understand why people fell in love with the prairie. The house sat on a small rise, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the morning light like jewels. The land stretched in every direction, rolling hills covered with grass that would soon be green with spring growth. Cattle dotted the pastures, black shapes moving slowly across the landscape like pieces in some vast slow-motion game. In the distance, I could see the barn, the equipment sheds, the windmill that had been pumping water for the stock tanks since Samuel's grandfather's whim. It was beautiful in a way that took my breath away. Not the manicured beauty of parks or gardens, but the world Functional beauty of land that was loved, intended, and used for its intended purpose. This was not a postcard or a painting. This was a working ranch that had supported my family for generations. The house was exactly as Samuel had left it. Coffee cups still sat in the sink. Newspapers were stacked neatly on the kitchen table, and his reading glasses lay folded on the arm of his favorite chair. It felt like walking into a life that was paused rather than ended, waiting for someone to pick up where Samuel had left off. In the study, Richard Morris showed me the filing cabinets where Samuel had kept meticulous records of every aspect of the ranch operation. Breeding records for the cattle, soil tests for the fields, maintenance schedules for the equipment, financial records going back decades. It was overwhelming and intimidating, and exactly what I needed to understand the scope of what I was taking on. But it was the photographs that really got to me. Pictures of Samuel as a young man, working alongside his father and grandfather. Pictures of my mother as a child, grinning from the back of a horse or helping with the harvest. Pictures of the land through the seasons, through droughts and floods, in the endless cycle of planting and growth and harvest that defined ranch life. In one frame on Samuel's desk, there was a picture of my mother at my age, standing in front of the barn with her arms crossed and a look of fierce determination on her face. Next to it was a more recent photo, one that made my heart stop. It was me, taken from a distance at my high school graduation. Samuel had been there, watching from the back of the auditorium, proud of a grandson he had never been able to claim. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the land that was now mine. The silence was different from anything I had ever experienced. Not the dead silence of the city at night, but a living silence full of wind and distant cattle and the rustle of grass. It was peaceful in a way that made me understand why Samuel had never wanted to leave, why this place had been worth fighting for through 4 generations of Sanders men. Justin Sanders, I said aloud, testing how the name sounded in the prairie air. Not the Justin Williams I had been in the system, but Justin Sanders, heir to a legacy I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, I met Christina Johnson, the ranch foreman who had been keeping things running since Samuel's death. She was in her 50s, weathered and competent, with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of making decisions that mattered. She had been expecting me, Richard Morris had called ahead, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes as she looked me over. "You ever worked cattle?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the directness of someone who did not have time for pretense. "No, ma'am," I admitted. "Never been on a horse either, but I am willing to learn." She nodded as if my honesty counted for something. "Samuel said you might say that. He also said you had the Sanders stubborn streak, which means you will probably kill yourself trying to prove you belong here instead of asking for help when you need it." Over the next few weeks, Christina became my teacher, my guide, and eventually something close to a friend. She showed me how to read the signs that told you when cattle were sick or stressed, how to fix a broken fence line, how to operate machinery that was older than I was, but still ran like a dream because Samuel had maintained it with religious devotion. The work was harder than anything I had ever done. My hands, soft from years of indoor life, cracked and bled until they finally toughened into something useful. My back ached from lifting feed sacks and wrestling with stubborn cattle. My legs trembled from hours in the saddle on a patient old horse named Duke, who seemed to understand that his new owner was learning everything from scratch. But there was satisfaction in the work that I had never found in any job before. When I fixed a section of fence, it stayed fixed. When I helped deliver a calf, I was part of bringing new life into the world. When I rode the pastures in the early morning, checking on the herd, I was continuing a tradition that connected me to generations of Sanders men who had done the same thing on the same land. The town watched my progress with the kind of polite interest that small communities reserve for outsiders who might or might not stick around. Some folks, like Stephen Garcia and Sandra Stewart, went out of their way to make me feel welcome, sharing stories about Samuel and offering advice about everything from the best feed supplier to the most reliable veterinarian. Others were more reserved, waiting to see if I was serious about staying or just playing at being a rancher until the novelty wore off. I could not blame them. They had seen city folks come and go before, drawn by romantic notions of country life that rarely survived the reality of early mornings and hard work and the isolation that came with living miles from your nearest neighbor. Richard Campbell, who ran the local bank, was particularly skeptical. He had been Samuel's banker for 30 years, had watched him build the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the county. When I came in to set up accounts and understand the financial side of the business, Richard made it clear that he would be watching closely to make sure I did not squander what Samuel had built. The ranch is profitable, he told me, spreading financial statements across his desk like evidence in a trial, but only because Samuel knew every dollar that came in and went out. He knew when to spend money and when to save it, when to take risks and when to play it safe. That kind of knowledge does not come overnight, and it sure does not come to someone who has never balanced anything more complicated than a checking account. He was right, of course. The financial complexity of running a ranch was staggering. Feed costs, veterinary bills, equipment maintenance, property taxes, insurance, fuel costs, market fluctuations that could wipe out months of profit in a single day. Samuel had navigated all of it with the skill that came from decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. But I had advantages that Samuel had not enjoyed when he was starting out. I had his records, his systems, his network of advisors and suppliers who were willing to help for his sake if not for mine. Most importantly, I had Christina, who understood the operation better than anyone and was willing to teach me if I was willing to learn. The real test came in late May when we had to move the cattle to summer pasture. It was a tradition that went back to Samuel's grandfather, moving the herd from the winter fields closer to the house to the higher pastures where the grass was richer and the water more abundant. It sounded simple enough in theory, but the reality was controlled chaos involving 200 head of cattle, 4 horses, 3 down, and more variables than I could keep track of. Christina had been planning the move for weeks, coordinating with neighbors who would help in exchange for similar assistance when they moved their herds. It was the kind of community cooperation that defined ranch life. Neighbors helping neighbors because everyone understood that the work was too big for any one operation to handle alone. The day of the move dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for what would be a bumming hard day in the saddle. I had been practicing for weeks, but riding in the relative safety of the home pasture was different from managing cattle across open range where anything could go wrong. The other riders were men who had been doing this work since they were children. They moved with an easy competence that made it look effortless, reading the herd's mood, anticipating problems before they developed, working together with the kind of wordless communication that came from years of shared experience. I tried to stay out of the way and follow Christina's instructions, but cattle have their own ideas about where they want to go and how fast they want to get there. When a group of young steers decided to break away from the herd and head back toward the barn, I found myself chasing them across rough ground at a speed that would have terrified me a month earlier. Duke, the old horse I was riding, seemed to understand the job better than I did. He anticipated the cattle's moves, positioning himself to turn them back toward the herd with minimal input from me. By the time we had the steers back where they belonged, I was breathing hard and my heart was racing. But I had done it. I had helped save the day, even if it was mostly due to my horse's experience rather than my own skill. The other riders nodded their approval when we rejoined the main group. It was not effusive praise, but in a community where competence was valued above all else, their acceptance meant everything. I was not a cowboy yet, might never be a real cowboy, but I was learning to do the work, and that was enough for now. That night, after the cattle were safely in their new pasture and the equipment was cleaned and put away, the neighbors gathered at the ranch house for the traditional end-of-drive barbecue. It was a party that Samuel had hosted every year, a way of thanking the people who had helped in celebrating another successful move. I had been nervous about hosting my first barbecue, worried that I would not live up to Samuel's reputation for hospitality. But Christina had helped me prepare, and the neighbors brought side dishes and stories and a warmth that made the evening feel like a homecoming rather than a test. Stephen Garcia told stories about Samuel as a young man, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned, and the gradual process of earning his place in the community. The stories were funny and touching and reassuring, reminding me that even Samuel had been an outsider once, that belonging was something you earned through time and effort and showing up when you were needed. As the evening wound down and the neighbors headed home to their own ranches and their own responsibilities, I felt something I had never experienced before. I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was part of something bigger than myself. It was not just the land or the work or the financial security, though all of those things mattered. It was the sense of community, of being known and accepted and valued for who I was and what I could contribute. That feeling grew stronger over the summer as I settled into the rhythm of ranch life. There were early mornings when the mist rose off the pastures like smoke, and late evenings when the sunset painted the sky in colors that no photograph could capture. There were days when everything went wrong, when equipment broke down and cattle got sick, and the weather refused to cooperate with carefully laid plans. But there were also days when everything clicked, when I felt the satisfaction of work well done and the deep contentment that came from living in harmony with the land and the seasons. I was learning to read the sky for signs of weather, to judge the condition of the grass, to understand the subtle signals that cattle gave when they were content or stressed or sick. By August, I was handling more of the daily responsibilities myself, though Christina was always there when I needed guidance or backup. The financial side of the business was becoming clearer too, thanks to patient tutoring from Richard Campbell and careful study of Samuel's records. I was starting to understand the delicate balance between income and expenses, the importance of planning ahead, the way that decisions made today would affect the ranch's profitability for years to come. The real turning point came in September when we had to deal with a crisis that tested everything I had learned. A section of fence along the county road had been damaged by a drunk driver, allowing 40 head of cattle to wander onto the highway. It was every rancher's nightmare, a situation that could result in massive liability if the cattle caused an accident. I got the call at 5 in the morning from the county sheriff, who knew the cattle were mine because they still wore Samuel's brand. By the time I got dressed and drove to the scene, there were cattle scattered along 2 miles of highway, some grazing peacefully in the ditch, others milling around in confusion. Christina was already there with two of the neighbors, working to round up the strays before the morning traffic got heavy. It was dangerous work, trying to move frightened cattle along a busy road while watching for cars that might not see them in the pre-dawn darkness. I had never handled anything like this before, but there was no time for hesitation or self-doubt. I grabbed a rope and joined the effort, working with the others to slowly, carefully guide the cattle back toward the damaged fence and into a temporary holding area we set up in an adjacent field. It took 3 hours to get all the cattle accounted for and safely contained. 3 hours of careful, methodical work that required every skill I had learned over the past 6 months. When it was over, when the last steer was back where he belonged and the temporary fence was in place, I realized something important had happened. I had not just helped with the roundup, I had led it. When decisions needed to be made quickly, the others had looked to me for direction. When the work got dangerous, they had trusted me to make the right calls. I was not just Samuel's heir anymore. I was the rancher, the one responsible for the operation and everything that came with it. The recognition felt good, but it also felt heavy. These people were depending on me to make good decisions, to honor Samuel's legacy, to be worthy of the trust they were placing in me. It was a responsibility I had never asked for, but one I was determined to live up to. The fence repair took most of the day, but it gave me a chance to work alongside neighbors who were becoming friends. We talked about cattle prices and weather patterns and the thousand small details that made up ranch life. They treated me as an equal now, not as Samuel's grandson or the kid from the city, but as Justin Sanders, rancher. That evening, I called Richard Morris to update him on the situation and to make sure I had handled the legal aspects correctly. His voice was weaker than it had been in the spring. The cancer was winning its battle, but he was pleased to hear that I had managed the crisis competently. Samuel would be proud, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. You are becoming the man he hoped you would be, the rancher this place needs. As autumn arrived and the cattle were brought back to the winter pastures, I reflected on how much had changed since that day in March when I first learned about my inheritance. I was no longer the scared kid who had aged out of the foster system with nothing but determination and a vague plan for the future. I was a landowner, a businessman, a member of a community that had accepted me as one of their own. The work was still hard, probably always would be. There were still days when I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, when I wondered if I was making the right decisions, when I missed the simplicity of my old life, where my only responsibility was to myself. But those doubts were becoming rarer, replaced by a growing confidence in my abilities and a deep satisfaction with the life I was building. I was not just surviving on the ranch, I was thriving. I was honoring Samuel's legacy while making it my own, continuing a tradition while adapting it to the realities of a new generation. The first winter was the hardest test yet. The work did not stop when the temperature dropped below freezing. It just got more difficult and more dangerous. Cattle still needed to be fed and watered, equipment still needed to be maintained, and the daily chores that kept the ranch running still had to be done regardless of wind or snow or the kind of cold that made your bones ache. But I was not facing it alone. Christina was there every day, teaching me how to read the weather, how to prepare for storms, how to manage the herd through the lean months when the grass was dormant and every calorie had to come from stored feed. The neighbors checked on me regularly, offering advice and assistance and the kind of practical support that made the difference between success and failure. By Christmas, I felt like I had truly found my place. The house was warm and comfortable, filled with the smell of wood smoke and coffee and the kind of cooking I was slowly learning to do for myself. I'd invited Christina and a few of the neighbors for Christmas dinner, continuing another of Samuel's traditions. As we sat around the table that had been in the Sanders family for 3 generations, sharing stories and laughter and the easy companionship of people who had worked together and weathered difficulties together, I felt a contentment I had never known was possible. This was what Samuel had wanted for me, I realized. Not just financial security or property ownership, but this sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than myself, of having a place in the world that was mine by choice and effort and the gradual accumulation of trust and respect. Richard Morris died that winter, peacefully in his sleep on a cold February night. The funeral was held at the Methodist church where Samuel had worshiped for 70 years, and it seemed like the entire county turned out to pay their respects to a man who had served his community with integrity and compassion for 5 decades. I was one of the pallbearers, an honor that would have seemed impossible a year earlier when I was just another kid aging out of the system. As we carried Richard's casket out of the church and into the bitter wind, I thought about the chain of events that had brought me to this moment. Without Richard's dedication to fulfilling Samuel's wishes, without his patient guidance through the legal complexities of my inheritance, none of this would have been possible. Spring came early that year, with warm weather and gentle rains that brought the grass back to life and filled the stock ponds that had been low after a dry winter. The cattle grew sleek and fat on the new grass, and the calving season brought 40 new additions to the herd, each one representing the continuation of the cycle that had sustained the ranch for over a century. I was no longer the novice who had arrived a year earlier with soft hands and city reflexes. I could read the sky for weather signs, judge the condition of the grass with a glance, and handle cattle with the kind of quiet competence that came from daily practice and hard-won experience. More importantly, I had found my identity. I was not just someone who owned a ranch, I was a rancher. I understood the responsibility that came with caring for the land and the animals, the way that good stewardship today ensured prosperity tomorrow, the delicate balance between taking from the land and giving back to it. The second summer brought new challenges and new opportunities. Cattle prices were strong, the grass was abundant, and I was confident enough in my abilities to start making improvements to the operation. I invested in new equipment, upgraded the handling facilities, and implemented some of the conservation practices I had been reading about in the agricultural journals that now filled my mailbox. But the most important development was personal rather than professional. I had started dating Sandra Stewart's daughter, Diane Howard, who had returned to Millfield after finishing college and was teaching at the elementary school. She was smart and funny and patient with my ongoing education and small-town life, and she understood the demands of ranch work in a way that someone from outside the community never could. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than the kind of passion that burned hot and fast. She had grown up around ranchers, understood the rhythm of the work and the way that the land and the weather and the market dictated the pace of life. When we talked about the future, it was with the assumption that it would be built here on this land as part of this community. By the time I had been on the ranch for 2 years, I was no longer the heir to Samuel's legacy. I was the continuation of it. I had earned my place not just through inheritance, but through work and commitment in the gradual accumulation of knowledge and skill that marked the transition from outsider to insider. The neighbors no longer thought of me as the kid from the city who might or might not stick around. I was Justin Sanders, the rancher who lived on the old Sanders place, who could be counted on to help with roundups and brandings and the dozen other cooperative efforts that kept the community functioning. I had also started to understand the deeper meaning of what Samuel had given me. It was not just land and cattle and financial security, though all of those things were important. It was the chance to be part of something that would outlast me, to contribute to a legacy that stretched back 4 generations and would hopefully continue for 4 more. The responsibility was humbling. Every decision I made affected not just my own future, but the future of the land itself, the sustainability of the operation, the continuation of a way of life that was becoming increasingly rare in a world that seemed to value efficiency over tradition, profit over permanence. But it was also liberating. I was no longer drifting through life without purpose or direction, no longer wondering where I belonged or whether I mattered. I had work that was meaningful, relationships that were deep and lasting, and a sense of place that anchored me in ways I had never experienced before. The third year brought its own tests and triumphs. A drought that lasted most of the summer forced difficult decisions about herd size and feed costs. A market downturn that cut cattle prices by 20% required careful financial management to maintain profitability. Equipment breakdowns and sick animals and all the other challenges that were part of ranch life tested my growing competence and resilience. But I weathered each crisis with increasing confidence, drawing on the knowledge I had accumulated and the network of advisors and friends who were always willing to help. I was no longer the novice who panicked at the first sign of trouble. I was an experienced rancher who understood that setbacks were temporary and that good management could overcome most obstacles. More importantly, I was happy. Not the fleeting happiness that came from momentary pleasures, but the deep contentment that came from living in alignment with my values, from doing work that mattered, from being part of a community that valued my contributions. The house that had once seemed so foreign was now truly home, filled with my own possessions and memories and the gradual accumulation of a life well lived. The land that had once been overwhelming in its scope was now familiar territory, every pasture and creek and hill known as intimately as the rooms of my house. I had also started to think seriously about the future, about marriage and family, and the next generation of Sanders who might someday inherit what I was building. Diane and I had talked about it, tentatively at first, but with growing certainty as our relationship deepened and our shared vision of the future became clearer. The thought of raising children on the ranch, of teaching them the same lessons that Christina had taught me, of passing on the knowledge and values that Samuel had preserved for me, felt like the natural continuation of the story that had begun with my great-great-grandfather's decision to homestead this land more than a century ago. On the 4th anniversary of my arrival in Millfield, I stood on the same porch where Samuel had spent his mornings, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over land that was now fully mine in every sense that mattered. The cattle were healthy, the grass was green, and the bank balance reflected the success that came from hard work and good management. But more than that, I was at peace. The angry, restless energy that had driven me through my teenage years had been replaced by a calm confidence in my place in the world. I was no longer searching for where I belonged. I was home. The journey from foster care to ranch ownership had been longer and more difficult than I could have imagined when I first received Richard Morris's letter. There had been moments of doubt and frustration, times when the work seemed impossible and the responsibility overwhelming. But there had also been moments of pure joy, times when everything clicked and I felt the deep satisfaction that came from living in harmony with the land and the seasons and the rhythms of rural life. Times when I understood why Samuel had fought so hard to preserve this place, why he had been willing to wait 17 years for the right person to inherit it. I was that person, not because of blood or genetics or any inherited talent for ranching, but because I had chosen to become that person. I had chosen to learn the work, to embrace the responsibility, to make this place my home in every way that mattered. The foster care system had taught me to be independent, to rely on myself, to expect nothing from others. But ranch life had taught me something different, something equally valuable. It had taught me the importance of community, of interdependence, of being part of something larger than myself. I was no longer the throwaway kid who had aged out of the system with nothing but determination and a vague plan for the future. I was Justin Sanders, rancher, landowner, member of a community that valued my contributions and trusted me with responsibilities that mattered. The transformation had not happened overnight. It had taken years of hard work, patient learning, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge and skill and respect. But it had happened, and it was real, and it was mine in a way that nothing else had ever been. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start another day of work, I thought about Samuel and the letter he had left for me. He had hoped I would choose to make this place my home, to continue the legacy he had preserved for me. I had done more than that. I had made it my own, adapted it to my own vision while honoring the traditions that made it valuable. The work was far from over. There would be more challenges, more decisions, more tests of my growing competence and commitment. But I was ready for them, confident in my abilities and secure in my place in this community and on this land. I had found what every person searches for, whether they realize it or not. I had found home, not just a place to live, but a place to belong, to contribute, to matter. A place where my choices had consequences that stretched beyond my own life, where my work contributed to something that would outlast me. Looking back on that scared 17-year-old who had received an impossible letter from a lawyer in Nebraska, I could hardly recognize myself. That kid had been searching for someone to want him, someone to claim him, someone to give him a place in the world. What I had found was something better. I had found the chance to earn my place, to prove myself worthy of the trust that had been placed in me, to become the person I was meant to be, rather than simply accepting whatever role others assigned to me. The sun was fully up now, painting the pastures in shades of gold and green that never got old no matter how many mornings I watched from this porch. The cattle were moving toward the water tanks, beginning another day of the endless cycle that had sustained this place for over a century. It was time to get to work. There were cattle to check, fences to mend, equipment to maintain, and the 1,000 other tasks that kept a ranch running smoothly. It was good work, meaningful work, work that connected me to the land and the animals in the community in ways that I was still discovering. But first, I wanted to share this story with you because I know there are others out there who are searching for the same thing I found. Others who feel like they do not belong anywhere, who wonder if anyone would miss them if they disappeared, who dream of finding a place where they matter. Maybe you are watching this from your own small town, or from a city apartment, or from somewhere in between. Maybe you are 17 like I was, or maybe you are older and still searching for where you belong. Wherever you are, whatever your story, I want you to know that home is not just a place you are born into or assigned to by circumstances beyond your control. Home is something you can choose, something you can build, something you can earn through work and commitment and the willingness to become part of something larger than yourself. It might not look like what you expect. It might not come in the package that you imagined, but it is out there waiting for you to find it. For me, it was a ranch in Nebraska that I inherited from a grandfather I never knew. For you, it might be something completely different. But the principles are the same. Be willing to work for it. Be willing to learn. Be willing to contribute rather than just take. Be willing to become the person your new community needs you to be. And remember that sometimes the best gifts come from the most unexpected places, from people who love you even when you do not know they exist, from opportunities that seem impossible until they become real. I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about your own journey to find where you belong. Tell me about the unexpected gifts that have changed your life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who is still searching for their place in the world. Subscribe to hear more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary purpose, about the power of community and hard work, and never giving up on the possibility that your life can be bigger and more meaningful than you ever dared to imagine. Because at the end of the day, we all deserve to belong somewhere. We all deserve to have work that matters and relationships that sustain us and a place in the world that is ours by choice and effort and love. I found mine on 1,000 acres of Nebraska prairie in a community that welcomed me home. You will find yours too. Just keep looking, keep working, keep believing that you matter and that somewhere out there is a place where you belong. The sun is shining, the cattle are calling, and there is work to be done. This is Justin Sanders, signing off from the Sanders Ranch, where every sunrise is a gift and every day is a chance to build something that will last.